Most of what people believe about the Mughal Empire is not wrong. It is just very incomplete. The story almost always centers on the same things: the monuments, the wars, the emperors, Akbar's tolerance, Aurangzeb's rigidity, the Taj Mahal as a love story frozen in marble. Those things are real, but they account for perhaps 5% of what life inside this empire actually looked like for the tens of millions of people who lived it every single day. At its height in the 17th century, the Mughal Empire was home to somewhere between 100 and 150 million people, more than a quarter of the entire world's population at the time. This was not a small court of kings and courtiers. This was a civilization, vast, layered, humming, stretching from the mountains of Kabul down through the plains of northern India across to Bengal in the east. It had cities that dwarfed almost anything in Europe at the same period. It had trade networks connecting it to Persia, China, the Ottoman Empire, East Africa, and eventually England and Portugal. It had a middle class. It had intellectuals, artists, astronomers, female poets, and merchants who traveled thousands of miles without leaving a single record of their names. And yet, when most people picture Mughal life, they picture a throne room, a man in an elaborate turban looking important. That image is real, but it is the rarest version of this world. Let us start with something that seems simple but opens everything up: food. The Mughal Empire essentially created what the world now recognizes as North Indian cuisine, the slow cooking method that became the basis of dum cooking, sealing a pot with dough and allowing ingredients to cook in their own steam for hours. This was a Mughal refinement, biryani, in the layered, fragrant form that is now one of the most beloved dishes on the planet. Was not born in a village kitchen. It was developed in royal kitchens by professional cooks given the time and resources to experiment across decades. But here is where things get interesting, because while royal kitchens were creating these elaborate preparations, ordinary Mughal households told a completely different story. Most families ate simple, seasonal food: lentils, flatbreads, local vegetables. Meat was not an everyday luxury. The diversity of what people ate across this empire was staggering, not because the empire ordered it, but because the land was different everywhere, and food was also politics. Akbar had systems in place to track grain prices across regions and adjust tax collection accordingly. When harvests failed, imperial grain stores could provide relief. This was not charity. It was the recognition that a hungry population was an unstable one, and stability was what allowed everything else to function. What is rarely mentioned is how the bazaar itself functioned as the beating heart of a Mughal city. Every major city, Agra, Lahore, Delhi, Fatehpur Sikri, had a central market that was more than just a place to buy and sell. It was where information traveled, where rumors became news, where a trader arriving from Kabul would share stories of the road, and a merchant heading toward Bengal would listen carefully before deciding his route. The bazaar was the city's nervous system, and the food stalls within it, the vendors selling hot bread fresh from clay ovens, the men ladling out lentil soup into clay bowls, the sweet sellers arranging their goods in careful pyramids. These people fed the city's daily rhythm in a way that no palace kitchen ever could. Now, let us talk about something that almost never appears in the popular imagination of Mughal life, women, the actual story of women in. Mughal society is far more textured and interesting than either the romantic fantasy or the simple oppression narrative allows. Nur Jahan, who married Emperor Jahangir in 1611, did not simply become a decorative consort. She issued imperial orders. Her name appeared on coins, one of the most direct expressions of sovereignty a Mughal ruler could authorize. She managed trade relationships with foreign merchants. She was, by any functional definition, a co-ruler for significant portions of Jahangir's reign, and historians have documented this for decades. Still, she rarely appears in the version of Mughal history most people carry. When we look closer, we see that Nur Jahan was not an anomaly. The royal women of the imperial household controlled enormous financial resources. Some owned property, some ran businesses, some personally directed architectural commissions. Gulbadan Begum, aunt of Emperor Akbar, wrote an actual first-person memoir of life inside. The Mughal Court, a document of extraordinary historical value left behind by a woman who was also simply a writer. Further down the social scale, women worked in textile production, one of the empire's most important industries. They participated in agricultural labor and ran small household businesses. The picture was complicated, as most real history is, perhaps the most overlooked dimension of Mughal life is the intellectual culture that existed at every level of this society. The imperial library under Akbar reportedly held over 24,000 manuscripts. Akbar himself, who by most accounts could not read, a detail that is itself endlessly fascinating, had texts read aloud to him for hours each day, philosophy, history, theology, science. He organized formal debates at his court between Sunni and Shia Muslims, Hindu philosophers, Jain monks, Zoroastrian priests, and Jesuit priests from Portugal, not as spectacle, but as genuine intellectual exercise. Whether this curiosity brought Akbar any personal spiritual certainty is something historians still debate. That ambiguity tends to get erased in simplified narratives, because ambiguity is harder to teach than a clean answer. What often goes unmentioned is how this intellectual energy flowed beyond the palace walls. Persian was the language of administration and high culture, which meant that aspiring professionals across many different ethnic and religious backgrounds learned it not as an act of cultural submission, but as a practical economic decision. A Hindu merchant in Rajasthan, who could read and write in Persian, had access to the full apparatus of imperial commerce. A young man from a modest family in Lahore, who mastered calligraphy and Persian, grammar, could find himself employed in a government office, his handwriting copied onto documents that would travel across the empire. Language was a ladder, and the Mughals, whether intentionally or not, left that ladder available to more people than we tend to imagine. And then there was the craft economy, something that rarely gets discussed but was absolutely central to how Mughal civilization sustained itself culturally and economically. The empire was one of the world's great producers of fine textiles. Muslin so thin it was described by foreign travelers as woven air. Silk brocades worked with gold thread in patterns. So intricate they required weeks of labor for a single yard of fabric. These were not luxury items made for export alone. They were part of an entire ecosystem of skilled labor, weavers, dyers, embroiderers, traders whose work connected the smallest village workshop to the grandest imperial court. A craftsman in Dhaka producing fine muslin was, without knowing it, participating in a global economy. His fabric might end up on a merchant ship headed to Persia or worn at a European court whose inhabitants had no idea where it came from or whose hands had made it. The Mughals were also deeply, seriously fond of beauty. Mughal gardens were not ornamental afterthoughts. The formal Sharbagh design, divided into 4 quadrants by water channels, was an attempt to create, in physical space, the image of paradise as described in Islamic tradition. To walk in such a garden was understood as a form of spiritual experience. The water was not just decorative. The water was meaning. Music was everywhere. Tanzin, who served at Akbar's court, is still regarded as one of the foundational figures of Hindustani classical music, the particular synthesis of Persian musical influences and the deep indigenous traditions of the subcontinent, shaped under Mughal patronage, gave rise to forms still practiced and performed today. The Mughal Empire formally dissolved in 1857, the last emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar himself, a poet of considerable skill, was exiled to Burma by the British, where he died 2 years later. The formal structure was gone. But 300 years of Mughal civilization did not disappear with the empire. The food, the music, the architecture, the garden aesthetic, the textile patterns, the poetry, these things continued. They evolved. They became part of a broader cultural inheritance that hundreds of millions of people carry today, without necessarily knowing where it came from. When someone in the United States sits down at an Indian restaurant and orders something slow-cooked and fragrant, they are at the far end of a chain of culinary transmission, running back centuries to a kitchen in a Mughal city, where someone was experimenting with spice and heat and time. When someone hears the particular melancholy of a late-night Hindustani raga, they are hearing something shaped, in part, by a court where Persian and ancient Indian musical cultures spent generations learning each other's language. And when someone runs their fingers across a piece of fine, embroidered fabric and pauses for just a moment, struck by the patience it must have taken to make it, they are, without knowing it, touching something that began in a workshop inside this empire, in the hands of someone whose name was never recorded. Perhaps the real lesson of Mughal history is not about power. Power is easy to see and easy to lose. Perhaps the more durable story is about what happens when a civilization decides that beauty matters, that learning matters, that a garden is worth designing carefully because the person walking through it deserves to feel something, that a meal is worth perfecting across generations because sitting down to eat together is one of the quiet ways human beings remind themselves that they belong to each other. Maybe the real story of the Mughal Empire is not about emperors at all. Maybe it is about the spice merchant arranging his bundles before sunrise, the woman carrying water with effortless grace, the young clerk carefully copying Persian letters by candlelight, hoping his handwriting is good enough to change his life, the weaver in Dhaka counting threads in the early morning light, building something beautiful that he will never see worn, the musician playing late into a warm night while the city listens without trying to. We may never fully know what it felt like to be an ordinary person inside that world. The records are incomplete. The voices never written down are gone, but the traces remain in kitchens, concert halls, gardens, and the slow, patient rhythm of a fountain running in a courtyard at dawn. History is never really finished. It just changes shape. If this stayed with you, share it with someone who thinks. History is just memorizing names and dates. Show them what it can actually feel like. And leave a comment. Tell us what part of Mughal life surprised you most. What do you wish you had been taught in school? We read everything. This has been Hidden Pages of History. Stay curious. See you in the next one.